The door slammed shut with a metallic clang that cut through the bunker like a gunshot. Dust fell from the ceiling as the metal bar dropped into place on the outside, locking everyone in. For a brief, suspended moment, the underground shelter was silent except for the muffled sound of boots retreating on the concrete stairs. Then the screams began. A child's voice, high, cracking, unmistakable, rose above the others. "Mama! Mama! Don't! Please!" Tiny fists pounded on the inside of the door, the echo colliding with the cold walls of the shelter. The child's scream sounded feral, as if clawing their way out of a nightmare. On the other side, the mother stood frozen, her hands still pressed to the thick steel. She could feel the vibrations of her child's fists through the metal, like a heartbeat she could no longer reach. She didn't cry. Her breath came in short, jagged bursts, and her eyes darted around the dim stairwell as if the shadows could swallow her whole. Behind her, distant artillery thundered, shaking the crumbling city above. Sirens wailed in the distance, rising and falling like the sound of an animal dying. A soldier halfway down the corridor yelled, his voice sharp and furious, "Are you insane? What the hell are you doing?" But the mother didn't respond. She stepped back from the door, her fingers trembling as they lingered on the rusted handle. Inside the bunker, chaos erupted. People were shouting, their voices clashing in terror and disbelief. One woman sobbed, a choking sound that wouldn't stop. A man banged on the door with his shoulder, shouting curses into the gap where the mother had just been. The child's voice kept cutting through it all, pleading, breaking, clawing for her. She turned away. The stairwell was narrow, lit only by a flickering emergency light that cast her face in fragments of shadow and pale illumination. Her eyes were hollow, sunken into her skull as if her body had been starving for months. Not just food, but something deeper. Her lips moved, but no words came out. She stepped back further into the stairwell, her hands trembling as if they were remembering something they didn't want to. Her child screamed her name. She shut her eyes. The soldier grabbed her arm. "You can still undo this," he barked, dragging her toward the door. "Open it! Now!" She pulled her arm free, violently enough that the soldier staggered. "No," she whispered, her voice so faint it was nearly swallowed by the sound of distant shelling. "What do you mean, no?" he spat. "Your own kid is in there." She stared past him, her gaze unfocused, as though looking at something far away or deep inside herself. Her hands clenched and unclenched at her sides, as if torn between running back and running as far as possible. The soldier stepped toward her again, but something in her face, something unbreakable, almost inhuman, made him stop. He hesitated, then stepped back. The child's cries softened, then sharpened again, each one a knife in her chest. She pressed the flat of her palm against the steel door one last time, feeling the cold radiate into her bones. Then she turned and walked away, boots whispering across the concrete floor. No one followed her. No one called her name. She climbed the stairs in silence, the sound of the shelter fading behind her until it was only memory. The night air outside was bitter and stung her lungs with each breath. Smoke curled from the shattered buildings, turning the sky the color of ash. She looked over her shoulder once, just once, at the heavy metal door buried in the earth. Her lips barely moved as she whispered into the wind, "I'm sorry." She knew her child would never hear it. "You have the right to judge her," a voice whispered over the sound of distant explosions, steady and brittle like cracked glass. "I would judge me too. I won't forgive myself either. But before you do, you should know what happened before that night." The voice lingered, almost pleading. Before the door, before the screams, before the choice that shattered me, there was a war, a sick child, and a mother who was already breaking apart. And maybe, just maybe, you'll understand why I walked away. The voice carried like smoke, winding through empty corridors and abandoned streets, as if the ruins themselves were listening. It was soft but unflinching, neither defending nor excusing what had happened. You have the right to judge me, the mother's voice said again, echoing like a confession to no one. You will say I am a monster, that I abandoned the only thing I ever truly loved, and you will be right. But before you seal my fate in your heart, I ask for one thing. Hear the whole story, then decide. The city above the bunker was unrecognizable. What had once been a place of noise and warmth now lay fractured. The buildings bent and hollowed out like carcasses. Windows hung from their frames, shards of glass glinting faintly in the thin moonlight. A burned-out tram rested on its side, metal warped from fire, its blackened skeleton casting jagged shadows on the street. She moved quietly, her boots scraping across the frost-coated pavement. Smoke clung to the air, thick and sour. Every few steps, she would glance behind her, though she knew no one was following. She imagined the soldier's face as he'd watched her leave, the stunned disbelief, the recoil of someone who had witnessed something he couldn't comprehend. She had seen that look before, in mirrors. The voice, still narrating her thoughts, cut deeper. Do you think I wanted this? Do you think I didn't dream of throwing the door open, of clutching my child and never letting go? That I didn't pray, every hour, that some miracle would save us? I wanted all of that, but miracles died with the first bomb, and dreams don't keep children alive. A distant explosion rumbled, faint enough that it felt more like memory than present danger. She stopped beneath the skeleton of a collapsed billboard, the image of a laughing family still visible through the soot. Her gaze lingered on it, her breath hitching. The faces in the photo were strangers, but for a split second, she imagined herself there, her child in her arms, laughing, untouched by war. The wind howled down the empty street, pulling her back to reality. She tightened the straps of the thin satchel slung across her shoulder. Inside it was everything she had left: a half-burned photograph of her child, a single can of water, a strip of cloth torn from her old dress. She touched the photograph gently, her fingers brushing over the charred edge. I didn't wake up that day intending to choose death over life, the voice continued. I only woke up to survive one more hour, one more day. That's how it starts. You tell yourself you're only doing what you must to protect them. And then one day you wake up and realize you don't know if what you're doing will save them or destroy them. She kept walking, the crunch of gravel beneath her feet loud in the silence. Shadows shifted in the alleyways, but no one stepped forward. Most who remained in the city after the evacuation were already dead or hiding, and she didn't know which was worse. A memory flickered, her child's hands, small and fever-warm, clutching her shirt as they slept in the shelter, their face pressed into her chest, their breath shallow but steady. She could still smell the faint sweetness of their hair, feel the rise and fall of their ribs beneath her hand. It was a memory she carried like a shard of glass inside her, precious and excruciating at once. The voiceover deepened, trembling at the edges now. I know what you think you saw back there. The door slamming, my child screaming. I know how it looked. But nothing in this world is as simple as it appears. You can call me selfish. You can call me cruel. You would be right. But I have to believe there was a reason. That even if I cannot see it now, one day, the choice I made will mean something. She stopped walking and looked up. Above the scorched skyline, the stars were faint, veiled by smoke. For a moment, she let herself hope they were still there, shining just as brightly beyond the haze. The voice lowered to a whisper. This is not a story about forgiveness. There's no one left to give me that. This is a story about what a mother will do when love is the only thing she has left, and even that isn't enough. She turned down a narrow street, the outline of her figure dissolving into the dark. Somewhere far away, the city groaned as another building collapsed, but she did not flinch. Before that door, the voice said, there was a world worth saving, and then there wasn't. Morning sunlight filtered softly through thin lace curtains, warming the peeling paint on the kitchen walls. The world outside still seemed intact then, unbroken. The only sounds were the faint hum of a distant train and the rhythmic ticking of the clock above the stove. It was an ordinary morning, though she didn't know it would be the last one she'd ever call normal. She stood at the small kitchen table, spreading jam, just a thin smear, over a single slice of bread. The jar was nearly empty, and she scraped the sides with the knife, her movements careful and precise, as if wasting even a crumb was a sin. At the table, her child sat cross-legged on a wobbly chair, chin resting in their palms. Here, she said softly, placing the bread in front of them. She didn't sit down. Not yet. She waited until the child took a bite, their small teeth tearing into the crust. Only when they chewed and smiled, jam painting their lips a faint red, did she allow herself to exhale. She wasn't hungry. She rarely was anymore, though her body was growing thinner by the week. She sipped weak tea instead, the bitter taste grounding her as she studied her child's pale face. Their cheeks were too hollow, their wrists too delicate, and she noticed the way they shivered even with the morning sun streaming in. She reached out and brushed her fingers against their forehead. Warm, but not feverish. At least not today. The house was modest, 2 small bedrooms, a sagging couch in the living room, and a vegetable garden behind the fence that had long since stopped producing enough. There was an old radio in the corner of the kitchen, its wooden casing scarred from years of use. Each morning, she turned it on as she prepared breakfast, letting the music or news fill the silence. But today, static filled the air before the announcer's voice cut through, flat and weary. Tensions escalating along the northern border, military deployments increasing, citizens advised to remain calm. She turned the volume down, glancing at her child. They looked up at her with curious eyes. Is it bad? They asked. She forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Just the usual noise, she said. Eat your breakfast. She turned her back before they could see her face, the way her expression crumpled as soon as they looked away. She leaned against the counter, staring at the chipped tile backsplash, her hand gripping the edge as if it could hold her together. Later, after the child was dressed and bundled in their worn coat, she walked them to the small school at the end of their street. They talked about ordinary things, the color of the sky, the promise of snow, how their teacher's dog had puppies last week. She nodded and asked questions, pretending not to notice the soldiers patrolling the square or the whispers that passed between neighbors on the sidewalk. Back at the house, she hung the laundry in the pale sun, her fingers stiff from the cold. The garden beds behind her lay barren, the soil brittle beneath the frost. She thought of the few coins left in her purse and how far they'd have to stretch. When the child returned home that afternoon, clutching a crumpled drawing from school, she knelt down and pulled them into a hug that lasted a second too long. The drawing was simple, a house, a tree, and the two of them holding hands under a blue sky. She smoothed it with her thumb and tacked it to the wall above the bed, hoping the paper would hold together even when the world around them didn't. That night, she sat by the window after the child was asleep, the radio silent now, the only light coming from the street lamp outside. She stared at the horizon, searching for something she couldn't name. It was quiet, but not the kind of quiet that comforted. It was the kind that made her skin prickle, as if the air itself was holding its breath. She wrapped her thin cardigan tighter around her shoulders and listened to the child's soft breathing in the next room. Her life revolved around that sound. Every choice, every sacrifice, every plan she made for the next day was built on the fragile hope that the breathing wouldn't stop. At that moment, she believed she could still protect them. She believed that if she was careful, if she rationed the bread and saved every coin, if she kept her head down and trusted that the world couldn't fall apart so easily, they would survive. She didn't know then how quickly fragile things break. The first sign came with a sound so distant, she almost convinced herself it was thunder. She was kneeling by the vegetable beds behind the house, her hands buried in the brittle soil. When the low rumble rolled across the horizon, she looked up at the pale winter sky, waiting for the clouds to gather. But the air was clear and dry. The earth trembled beneath her knees just enough to unsettle the breath in her chest. By the time the radio confirmed what her body already knew, the city was already unraveling. Northern border breached. State of emergency declared. Citizens advised to seek shelter. Samsa. The announcer's voice was strained, trying and failing to sound calm. She stood in the kitchen, her child's small hand clutching her sleeve, as the words blurred together into something cold and final. Breached. Emergency. Shelter. It felt like listening to a stranger read her fate aloud. The streets outside erupted into noise before she had a chance to think. Doors slammed, engines roared to life, and neighbors shouted to one another in panic. She pushed her child into their coat, tightening the buttons with trembling fingers, and grabbed her threadbare purse. There was no time to gather much else, just the last of their coins and the photograph on the wall, yanked free so quickly it tore at the corner. She tried the corner store first. The glass door was already shattered, people pouring in and out with their arms full. Shelves had been stripped bare in minutes. Someone shoved her shoulder hard as she tried to squeeze through the doorway, sending her stumbling backward into the street. She clutched her child close, whispering, "It's okay. We'll find somewhere else," though she could barely breathe herself. At the market square, the chaos was worse. Stalls had been overturned, fruit crushed underfoot, bags of rice ripped open and spilling into the gutter. She reached for a sack, only for a man twice her size to snatch it from her grasp. She begged, quietly, desperately, but he didn't even look at her. He was gone before she could say another word. A single loaf of bread sat abandoned on a broken table, and she lunged for it. Another hand reached the bread at the same time. She looked up into the eyes of a woman she recognized from 2 houses down, eyes wide, almost wild. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. Then the woman yanked the bread away, clutching it to her chest. The mother stepped back, pulling her child behind her. "It's okay," she murmured, though her throat felt like it was closing. "We'll be okay." But she knew they wouldn't. Not without food, not without medicine, not with the fever that lingered at the edge of her child's small, trembling body. She turned away from the square and hurried home, weaving through the crowd as the world dissolved into shouting and sirens. Soldiers stood at intersections now, rifles slung across their backs, their faces pale and tense. One barked at her to move faster as she crossed the street. She didn't look back. At the house, the child sat silently at the kitchen table, clutching their knees, their eyes wide and uncertain. She knelt in front of them and took their hands in hers, forcing a smile onto her face. "It's just for a little while," she said. "We'll stay here until it's safe." But that night, she heard the distant artillery again, closer this time, rattling the glass in the window panes. Her child stirred in bed, murmuring in their sleep, and she stroked their hair until they settled. She couldn't sleep. She sat by the window with the lights off, her hands wrapped around her own elbows. In the distance, faint glows flickered where shells had landed. The sound of distant crying seeped through the walls from the houses around her. She told herself this would pass, that the soldiers would push the fighting back beyond the border, that the stores would reopen, that she would find medicine and bread and a way to keep her child warm. But something deep inside her, a quiet instinct she had learned to trust, told her that the first crack had already split wide open, and once something breaks like that, there's no putting it back together again. The knock came just before dawn, a thin, tentative sound that barely carried through the cold, silent house. She woke instantly, heart hammering, because knocks at that hour were never good. For a long moment, she didn't move. She just sat upright in bed, clutching the thin blanket to her chest and listening. The knock came again. She slipped from the bed, careful not to wake her child who was curled up beside her, their face pale against the threadbare pillow. Her feet were silent on the wooden floorboards as she crept to the door. "Who is it?" she whispered. No answer, just a soft shuffle, like someone shifting their weight outside. She hesitated, then cracked the door open an inch. Two faces stared back at her. The first was a girl, no older than 15, her dark hair clumped with dirt, her clothes ragged and soaked through with frost. Beside her, a boy slumped heavily against the doorframe, younger than the girl by several years. His cheeks were flushed with fever, lips cracked and dry. He didn't open his eyes. "Please," the girl whispered, her voice raw. "We just need somewhere warm, just for a little while." The mother's first instinct was to close the door, not because she wanted to, but because she had nothing, no food to offer, no space, no safety to give. Her own child was fragile, barely surviving on what little she could scrounge. Taking in strangers felt like handing both children over to death. But the girl's eyes, wide and desperate, held her there. She opened the door wider, motioning them inside. The boy stumbled forward, the girl's thin arms barely able to hold him up. Together, they lowered him onto the couch. He curled instinctively into himself, shivering despite the blanket she threw over him. "Sit," the mother said quietly, leading the girl to the chair by the table. She poured a mug of water from the chipped kettle, its contents barely lukewarm, and placed it in her hands. The girl held it like it was a treasure. "Where are your parents?" the mother asked. "Dead," the girl said simply, staring into the water. "They told me to run south, said there would be help, but—" Her voice cracked, and she didn't finish. The mother didn't ask more. She knew the shape of loss, even if she hadn't had to speak it yet. Instead, she rummaged through the cupboard, pulling out a small heel of bread she had been saving for her child's breakfast. She hesitated, just a heartbeat, then placed it in front of the girl. "Eat," she said. The girl shook her head. "It's for him," she whispered, glancing at her brother on the couch. "You both eat," the mother insisted. From the bedroom, her child appeared in the doorway, rubbing their eyes with a small fist. "Mama?" they murmured, voice heavy with sleep. The mother smiled faintly and beckoned them over. "It's okay," she said softly. "We have guests." Her child stood by the couch, staring curiously at the boy's fever-flushed face. They reached out a tentative hand, then pulled it back, uncertain. "Is he sick?" they asked. "Yes," the mother said quietly, "but we'll take care of him." The girl finished the bread slowly, as if each bite hurt. "We won't stay long," she said. "I just didn't know where else to go." The mother studied her. She looked so much older than 15 and yet so fragile. Her shoulders hunched as if she'd been carrying the world alone. "You'll stay," the mother said firmly, "until he's strong enough to walk, until you're safe." The girl's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't cry. She just nodded. Later that day, the mother ventured out to look for medicine. The streets were even more chaotic now. Soldiers shouting orders at civilians, shops barricaded or looted. She managed to find an elderly nurse at the end of the street who gave her a few tablets in exchange for a small silver ring she'd once worn on her wedding finger. When she returned, the boy was sleeping more soundly, the fever breaking little by little. Her child sat beside him, whispering stories as if the words themselves could heal. The mother stood in the doorway, watching the three of them, the faintest ache stirring in her chest. She didn't know how long they could keep this fragile arrangement alive, but for the moment, they were together, and the house felt less like an empty shell. That night, as the distant rumble of artillery echoed through the city again, she sat by the window with the girl and whispered, "We'll make it through this, all of us." She wanted to believe it. The house could no longer keep them safe. The walls that once held their quiet routines were too thin now, too fragile against the tremors of war. By the fourth night after the strangers arrived, the city had become a carcass picked clean. Soldiers barked curfews, sirens screamed through the smoke, and distant bombs turned the horizon into fire. When the order came to evacuate, it was not a request. A soldier hammered on their door, his rifle slung over his shoulder, shouting that anyone who stayed above ground would be left to the blast. He didn't wait for questions. He didn't care who lived there. He just moved on, pounding on the next door as armored vehicles growled past the windows. The mother stuffed what little they had into a tattered satchel, 2 cracked bowls, a single blanket, the photograph of her child. She hesitated at the cupboard, staring at the crumbs of stale bread in the bottom of a tin, and swept those into her palm too. Every scrap mattered now. "Come on," she whispered, her voice taut as she gathered the children. Her child clung to her leg, the refugee girl clutching her feverish brother to her chest. They stepped into the street as the first spotlight swept across the rooftops. The journey underground felt like a funeral procession. Neighbors moved in silence, their faces pale, their hands clutching bundles of clothes and keepsakes. The air was heavy with unspoken fear as they descended into the subway entrance, the world above shrinking behind them. The tunnels were colder than she expected. Damp dripped from the cracked ceiling, running down the slick concrete walls like tears. The old tracks gleamed faintly under the glow of lanterns strung along the walls. The smell was sharp, rust, mildew, and the lingering stench of garbage that had been left to rot long before the war reached them. The space had once been a bustling underground station, but now it was a shelter cobbled together from scraps. Mattresses lay side by side on the floor, leaving barely enough room to walk. Blankets hung from wires to carve out the illusion of privacy. At the far end, a small group of civilians huddled around a sputtering oil drum fire, their eyes wary as the new arrivals stepped inside. The mother led the children to an empty corner, setting down their bag with a muted thud, She spread the blanket on the floor and coaxed her child to sit, then helped the girl lay her brother down beside them. He stirred faintly, his fevered breath shallow, but he didn't wake. A stern, gray-haired nurse approached, her posture straight despite the cold. 1 piece of bread per person per day, she said without greeting, holding out a ledger for names. Water is rationed, no fighting over rations. Anyone caught stealing will be sent out. The mother nodded and gave their names quietly. When she reached for the bread, the nurse's sharp eyes scanned the children. "He's ill," the nurse said, nodding to the refugee boy. "Keep him warm. I don't have medicine to spare." "I understand," the mother whispered, though the words tasted like defeat. She carried the ration bread back to their corner, 4 thin slices, barely enough for a meal. Her child stared at it hungrily, but she broke each piece in half, pressing the larger halves into the children's hands. The smallest portion she saved for herself, though it felt like swallowing air. The hours bled together in the tunnel. The children whispered in the dark, their voices fragile, as the distant thunder of bombs rolled through the earth. The mother kept count of the days in her head, terrified that if she stopped, time itself would erase them. She walked the length of the shelter when she couldn't sleep, watching the others in their makeshift beds, faces blurred together, parents clutching their children, old men coughing into rags, young women staring blankly at the dripping ceiling. Trust had already begun to fray. If someone's ration went missing, accusations flew. Small arguments erupted into shoving matches, and the nurse's tired voice was the only thing keeping the fragile order from collapsing. Her child coughed softly one night, the sound ragged and weak, and she pressed a damp cloth to their lips. "Sleep," she whispered, though her hands trembled. The fever was coming back. She could feel it in the heat of their skin. As the children slept, she sat against the wall, hugging her knees. The tunnel was silent except for the drip of water and the occasional sob from someone dreaming of home. She stared into the darkness and wondered how long they could survive like this. The thought that crept into her mind terrified her. Surviving wasn't the same as living. The bread was thinner now. The rations had been cut in half, and even those meager slices felt like they were growing smaller each day. The mother sat cross-legged on the cold concrete floor of the tunnel, her back pressed to the damp wall as she cradled the half slice of bread in her palm. It was rough and stale, crumbling slightly when she pressed her thumb into it. She looked at her child, their frail body wrapped in the single blanket they all shared, and tore the bread carefully in 2. "This is yours," she said softly, holding out the larger piece. Her child shook their head. "But you'll be hungry," they whispered. "I'm fine," she lied. "Eat it while it's still warm." It wasn't warm, it hadn't been for days. But the child didn't argue further. They nibbled at the bread slowly, savoring each dry bite. The mother watched them eat and ignored the ache in her stomach, the dizzy emptiness that had become her constant companion. The shelter had grown colder since they'd first arrived, as though the earth itself was freezing around them. Oil lamps flickered weakly, casting shadows that danced like ghosts along the curved tunnel walls. The air smelled of mildew, unwashed bodies, and sickness. Somewhere down the tunnel, someone coughed, a deep, rattling sound that never seemed to stop. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to remember the last time she'd seen sunlight. It felt like years ago, though it had only been weeks. The children's laughter, the warmth of the garden, even the scent of jam on bread. Those memories were beginning to feel like dreams she'd once had. The nurse passed by, her lined face even sterner in the dim light. "How's the boy?" she asked, nodding to the refugee child, who lay curled in his sister's lap. "Still sick," the mother said quietly. He hasn't eaten in 2 days. The nurse's lips pressed into a thin line. We don't have enough medicine for everyone. If his fever doesn't break? She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. The girl tightened her grip around her brother, her eyes wide with fear. Please, she whispered. He's all I have. The nurse moved on without replying. That night, the shelter erupted in whispers when a small child, one of the younger ones, died of the cold. His mother wailed, clutching his tiny body as others looked away. Shame etched into their faces. There was no ceremony, no burial. The nurse wrapped him in a thin sheet and carried him away alone. The mother's hands shook as she held her child close. She could feel their ribs through their shirt, each breath shallow and fragile. She whispered a lullaby, the same one she'd sung before the war, but her voice cracked on the last line. The next morning, she awoke to find her child's lips cracked from thirst, their eyes half-lidded with fever. She pressed the back of her hand to their forehead and felt the heat searing through their skin. Her heart clenched painfully in her chest. The nurse announced a new ration that day. 1 loaf of bread would be distributed among the shelter, enough for a single person. Arguments broke out immediately. People shouted, their voices echoing in the tunnel, accusations flying. My child needs it more. I haven't eaten in 3 days. Why should they get it when we're all starving? The loaf sat on a broken crate in the center of the shelter, guarded by the nurse like a treasure. The mother stood at the edge of the crowd, clutching her child's trembling hand, and watched the chaos unfold. She thought of their fever, the way their body burned in her arms. She thought of the refugee girl's brother, his eyes dull with sickness. She thought of the last child who had died, his mother's scream echoing through the tunnels. Her body moved before her mind caught up. She stepped forward, lifted the loaf from the crate, and turned, not toward her child, but toward the refugee girl and her brother. She knelt down and pressed the bread into their hands. Take it, she whispered. The girl's mouth opened in shock. But your child. Take it, the mother said again, her voice firmer now. She didn't look back at her own child as the girl tore the bread and began to feed her brother. She sat on the cold floor, staring at the cracks in the concrete, and felt a bitter weight settle in her chest. I hated myself for doing the right thing, she thought, because the right thing wouldn't save my child. The shelter no longer felt like a refuge. It felt like a cage. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and fear, and the cold gnawed at the bones of everyone inside. Whispers filled the dark corners, sharp as broken glass, as people eyed one another with suspicion. Trust had evaporated, replaced by the constant question, who will take from me next? It started small, blankets missing from makeshift beds, an extra cup of water unaccounted for. People looked at each other longer than necessary, trying to calculate guilt. But after the death of the small boy 2 nights before, the tension erupted. You took it, didn't you? A man snarled, pointing at a woman clutching her baby. I saw you hide something under your blanket. She shook her head, terrified. I didn't, I swear. Liar, he spat, stepping toward her. Your baby's fat while the rest of us starve. The mother watched from the edge of the crowd, clutching her child to her chest. Her heart thudded painfully as the argument escalated into shouts, then shoves. The nurse pushed through the crowd, her voice hoarse as she tried to separate them. Enough, she barked, though the strain in her face showed how close she was to breaking too. If we turn on each other, none of us will survive. But the words meant little now. Everyone had grown too desperate, too afraid. Hunger eroded compassion faster than anything. That night, The mother sat in their corner of the shelter, her child asleep in her lap. The refugee girl and her brother lay beside them, curled together under the thin blanket. The boy's fever had lessened since the bread, but he was still weak, his breathing shallow. The girl looked at the mother, her eyes glistening. "Why did you give it to us?" she asked in a whisper, so soft it was almost lost in the drip of water from the ceiling. The mother stared at the wall. "Because I could," she said finally. "But your child—" The words lodged in the girl's throat, and she didn't finish. She didn't need to. The mother's gaze shifted down to her own child. Their small body was light as a bird in her lap, their skin clammy despite the cold. She brushed a strand of hair from their forehead, her hand trembling. A muffled sob came from the other side of the tunnel. The mother recognized the voice immediately, the woman whose baby had been accused of stealing food earlier. She didn't move. She knew better now than to intervene. The next morning, when the shelter stirred awake, the woman and her baby were gone. Some said they'd left in the night, trying to reach the southern border. Others whispered that someone had driven them out. No one asked out loud. The mother kept her head down as she joined the ration line. Her stomach cramped painfully as the nurse handed her a small piece of bread, barely enough to fit in her palm. Her child looked up at her with glassy eyes, too sick to stand. She crouched and pressed the bread into their hands. "Eat slowly," she murmured, forcing a smile. Her child hesitated. "Aren't you hungry?" "I'm not," she lied again. She turned away before they could see the hollow ache in her eyes. That night, as the shelter settled into uneasy silence, she heard someone moving near their corner. She opened her eyes to see a man crouching near the blanket, his hand reaching for the satchel beside her. "Stop!" she said sharply, her voice cutting through the dark. The man froze. "I wasn't—" "You were," she said, rising to her feet. The sound of her voice stirred the others. The nurse appeared, clutching a rusted length of pipe like a weapon, and the man stumbled back, his hands raised. "I was just looking for food," he muttered. "There's no food left to steal," the nurse said flatly. The man's shoulders slumped, and he slunk back into the shadows, muttering curses under his breath. The mother returned to her corner, her heart still pounding. She wrapped her arms around her child and held them close, the reality of their situation pressing in like the tunnel walls. No one was coming to save them. No one could be trusted. And she was running out of time. She looked at her child's face, pale and gaunt in the lamplight, and felt something inside her crack open. She didn't know how much longer they had, but she knew one thing with terrifying certainty. Survival here would demand something she wasn't ready to give. The first time she saw the ticket, it didn't feel real. A young soldier appeared in the tunnel at dawn, his uniform stained with dirt, his face gaunt from sleepless nights. He held a clipboard in one hand and a small bundle of envelopes in the other. Behind him, 2 other soldiers stood guard, their rifles slung across their chests. The entire shelter went silent as he stepped forward, the sound of his boots echoing off the concrete walls. "This is it," he announced, voice hoarse. "There's a final evacuation transport leaving in 48 hours. 1 convoy. We've been given limited spots." Murmurs broke out instantly. People surged forward, desperate to be heard, to be counted, but the soldier raised a hand. "Don't. This isn't a line. We were told exactly who qualifies. The lists were made at command." The mother stood frozen in the back, clutching her child's thin shoulders. She felt their shallow breaths against her palm. She could already sense the fever worsening again, their skin clammy, their heartbeat fluttering like a trapped bird. The soldier read names from the clipboard, handing envelopes to the few who stepped forward. The tension in the air was unbearable. Each name called was followed by sighs of relief or choked sobs. Each name not called felt like a death sentence. When the soldier spoke her name, she didn't react at first. She thought she'd imagined it. Only when the nurse nudged her forward did she blink and step into the open. The soldier handed her a thin envelope, the weight of it insignificant yet crushing. "One adult, one child," he said quietly. "That's all the ticket allows. You'll be escorted to the rendezvous point tomorrow night. Don't be late." She nodded mutely, clutching the envelope to her chest as if it might vanish. The soldier's eyes softened as he looked at her child, who was leaning heavily against her leg. "If you need forged papers to switch the names, I might be able to help," he murmured under his breath, so no one else would hear. "It's risky, but I don't like leaving people behind." She shook her head, not trusting her voice. She didn't want to owe anyone, not when the cost could be someone else's life. When she returned to their corner, the refugee girl stared at the envelope in her hands. Her brother, still pale but stronger than before, sat beside her, watching silently. "You got one," the girl said softly. "Yes," the mother whispered. The girl's eyes flickered to the child asleep against her shoulder. "That's good," she said, though her voice trembled. "You'll be safe now." The mother looked down at the envelope, at the ink smudged from her sweaty palms. "One adult, one child." The words rattled in her head like stones. She imagined stepping onto the convoy, clutching her child's hand, watching the refugee girl and her brother fade into the crowd they were leaving behind. She imagined her child coughing on the transport, their fever spiking as the days stretched on. She imagined their small body weakening, her arms too empty to hold them when the inevitable happened. That night, she couldn't sleep. She sat against the wall with her child's head in her lap, running her fingers through their tangled hair. Every few minutes, she checked their pulse, terrified at how faint it felt. The refugee girl sat across from her, cradling her brother. She didn't speak, but her wide, haunted eyes said everything. The nurse approached quietly, crouching beside the mother. "You know your child's very sick," she said softly. "If the fever doesn't break, they won't make it through the week, even with the ticket." The words sliced through the mother like a blade. She wanted to scream, to deny it, but the truth was written in her child's hollow cheeks and labored breathing. "Sometimes," the nurse continued, her voice heavy, "the kindest thing you can do isn't the thing you want to do." The mother looked away, her vision blurring with tears she wouldn't let fall. In the darkness, the envelope felt like a curse in her hands. One adult, one child. She couldn't stop asking herself the same question. If you could save someone, but not the one you love most, could you live with yourself? She found a stub of pencil buried at the bottom of the satchel and an old sheet of paper so worn it was already tearing at the folds. She smoothed it carefully against the cold concrete floor, afraid the fragile paper would disintegrate beneath her fingers. The tunnel was quiet. Most of the others were asleep, their shallow breaths and occasional coughs echoing softly off the walls. The nurse had extinguished the lamps hours ago, leaving only the faint glow of a single lantern near the ration table. Its light didn't reach her corner, so she hunched low, writing by the memory of her own trembling hand. The words came slowly at first, her hand shaking with every stroke. "My love," she began. She paused, staring at the letters as if they might speak back to her. She didn't know if her child would ever read this. She didn't know if she would even survive long enough to pass it along. But she wrote anyway. because it was all she could do. If you're reading this, I am gone. I can't tell you why yet. I can't tell you how much I wanted to stay. I can only tell you that this world took everything from us, and I couldn't let it take you too. She stopped, her chest tightening as she looked down at her child. They were sleeping fitfully, their face pale and damp with fever. She brushed the damp hair from their forehead, her heart breaking at how light their body had become in her arms. She returned to the letter. You have always been my reason. Every bite of bread, every breath I took, every tear I never let you see. It was all for you. I wish I could promise I will always be there to hold you, but I can't promise lies. Her pencil faltered, her throat burned with unshed tears. She wanted to write something hopeful, something that would tell her child that everything would be okay. But she couldn't force herself to lie. Across the tunnel, the refugee girl stirred. She rose quietly, careful not to wake her brother, and padded over. She crouched beside the mother, her eyes red from lack of sleep. Are you writing a goodbye? She whispered. The mother nodded faintly, unable to speak. The girl looked down at the paper. Do you know what you'll do? She shook her head. I can't decide. You'll go, the girl said, her voice barely audible. You have to, for your child. The mother turned to her sharply. And what about you, your brother? The girl's jaw tightened. We'll be fine, she lied. The mother wanted to believe her. She looked back at her sleeping child and tried to imagine the future. Days of running, hiding, and starving, their frail body growing weaker with each mile. She imagined the convoy reaching safety, her child's fever spiking too high, their small body going still in her arms. The thought was unbearable. Her hand moved across the paper again, the words pouring out faster now. One day, maybe you'll understand. Love is not always holding on. Sometimes it's letting go. Even when it rips you apart, I don't expect you to forgive me. I just want you to live. Please, live. Her breath hitched as she signed the letter with a single initial. Her name felt too heavy to write. She folded the paper carefully, pressing the crease flat with her thumb. She didn't know what to do with it yet. She just knew that if she left it here, someone would find it. The girl reached out, placing a hand on her shoulder. Whatever you choose, she said quietly, it will be the right thing. The mother didn't believe that. She doubted she ever would. She tucked the letter into her satchel and sat in silence for the rest of the night, holding her child in her arms and listening to the sound of their labored breathing. She didn't sleep. She couldn't. Tomorrow she would have to decide. Morning came without light. The tunnels were as dark as ever, but there was a subtle shift in the air, a kind of stillness that made every breath heavier. The convoy would depart in a matter of hours, and the knowledge hung over the shelter like a death sentence. The mother sat cross-legged in their corner, her child curled against her chest. She could feel every rib through the thin shirt, could feel the weak rise and fall of their breath. She brushed their hair back, studying the fevered flush in their cheeks, the way they stirred even in sleep, as if their small body could no longer find comfort anywhere. One adult, one child. She glanced at the envelope in her lap. It felt like it was burning her hands. She imagined showing it at the convoy gate, her child clinging to her side, stepping onto the transport while the others watched. She imagined the refugee girl and her brother standing at the edge of the crowd, their faces hollow as the convoy drove away. A bitter voice inside her whispered, "But they are stronger. They might survive." She bit down on the thought so hard it felt like her teeth would crack. She couldn't choose. She couldn't condemn her own child. And yet, The nurse appeared suddenly, crouching beside her. She placed a hand on the child's forehead, her frown deepening. "The fever's worse," she murmured. "If you take them on the convoy without medicine, they won't make it to the border." The mother's breath hitched. "But if we stay—" The nurse didn't answer. She didn't need to. The refugee girl was watching her from across the tunnel. She held her brother close, his eyes wide but alert now. He looked better, thin and weak, but no longer at death's door. The girl's expression was guarded, as though she already knew what the mother was thinking. The mother rose slowly and walked toward them. Her child stirred. Clinging to her neck as she knelt in front of the girl, she held out the envelope with trembling hands. "Take it," she whispered. The girl's eyes widened. "No, no, you can't." "Take it," the mother repeated, her voice firmer now. Tears welled in the girl's eyes as she stared at the envelope. "But your child—" "My child won't survive the journey," the mother said, her voice breaking on the words. "Yours might. Please, I need to know that someone will make it out." The girl shook her head violently. "I can't do this. I can't take your place." "You have to," the mother whispered. "If you stay, he'll die. I can't save my child, but I can save yours." For a long moment, neither of them moved. The girl's hands hovered over the envelope as if it might turn to ash at her touch. Finally, with a choked sob, she took it, clutching it to her chest like a lifeline. The mother returned to her corner and sat with her child, holding them tighter than she ever had. She pressed her face into their hair, breathing in the faint sweetness that still lingered there. "I love you," she whispered. "I love you more than anything." Her child's small hand rested weakly against her cheek. "Mama?" they murmured, eyes barely opening. "I'm here," she said softly. "I'm not going anywhere." She didn't know if it was true. Hours later, the shelter stirred as the soldiers called for those with tickets. People rose slowly, clutching their children, their bundles, their hopes. The girl approached the mother one last time, her brother's hand clasped tightly in hers. "Thank you," she whispered. The mother didn't answer. She only pulled the girl into a brief embrace, her hands trembling as she let go. She watched from the shadows as the girl and her brother disappeared into the crowd, following the soldiers up the stairs. The sound of boots and voices grew faint, then vanished entirely as the convoy departed. The shelter was quiet again. Those left behind avoided one another's eyes, each locked in their own private despair. The mother sat motionless in the corner, her child sleeping against her shoulder, her eyes fixed on the empty stairs. She had made the choice, and now she would live with it. The silence after the convoy left was unbearable. It felt like the entire world had exhaled its last breath and gone still. The tunnels, once filled with restless movement and voices, were now hollow. Only those left behind remained, each one a shadow of despair pressed against the walls. The mother sat in their corner, her child still burning with fever against her chest. She could feel the shallow flutter of their heartbeat and tried to will her own strength into their fragile body. She stroked their hair, whispering words they were too far gone to hear. "I'm here. I won't leave you." But she knew she already had. The day passed in a blur. No rations were distributed. The nurse explained they had nothing left. She moved from group to group, checking pulses, murmuring instructions, her hands shaking. The strain had carved deep lines into her face. By nightfall, the bombs started again, at first distant, then closer. The sound reverberated through the tunnels like the growl of some enormous beast. Dust trickled from the ceiling as each explosion drew nearer. "Get away from the walls!" someone shouted. Panic rippled through the shelter. The mother stood, clutching her child to her chest, and backed toward the center of the tunnel. Her eyes darted to the stairs where the convoy had departed, but no one was coming back. No one would rescue them now. The first blast hit so close that the ground split beneath their feet. The tunnel screamed with the sound of collapsing steel and stone. People ran, stumbling, pushing past one another as the ceiling caved in. She fell hard, landing on her knees with her child still in her arms. The world spun. Shards of concrete rained down, slicing into her shoulder, but she didn't feel the pain. She crawled, desperate, toward the far end of the tunnel as another explosion shattered the darkness. The nurse was shouting something, orders, prayers. She couldn't tell. Then the nurse's voice was swallowed by the roar of fire. The mother ducked under a fallen beam, dragging her child with her, and pressed herself into a narrow space in the rubble. She covered their body with her own, shielding them as best she could. The ground bucked again, the deafening sound ripping through her ears until she could hear nothing but a high-pitched ringing. She whispered their name over and over, like a mantra, like a lifeline. "Stay with me, please. Stay with me." The last blast came without warning. The force of it knocked the air from her lungs, and the tunnel went black. When she opened her eyes, it was quiet. The air was choked with dust, so thick she could barely see a foot in front of her. She coughed violently, each breath like swallowing glass. Her arms ached from holding her child, but she didn't dare loosen her grip. "Sweetheart," she whispered hoarsely. There was no answer. Her heart pounded as she shifted them in her arms. Their head lolled limply against her shoulder. She pressed her fingers to their neck, searching for a pulse. Nothing. "No," she breathed. She tried again, pressing harder, her hands shaking uncontrollably. Still nothing. She clutched their body to her chest, rocking back and forth, unable to stop the broken sobs that tore through her. Her tears streaked through the dust on her face, falling into her child's hair. The tunnel was unrecognizable now. The shelter had collapsed in on itself, the walls reduced to jagged heaps of concrete and twisted rebar. She was alone. She pressed her forehead to her child's, inhaling the faint trace of their scent one last time. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, the words shattering in her throat. When she finally moved, it was because she had no choice. She laid her child gently on the rubble, smoothing their hair as if they were only sleeping. Her hands lingered, trembling, before she forced herself to let go. She crawled through a narrow gap in the debris, her clothes tearing on sharp edges, the pain in her body barely registering. Above, she glimpsed a faint gray light, the surface. She clawed her way toward it, every breath a battle. When she emerged, the city was gone. There were no soldiers, no sirens, no convoys, only ruins, charred buildings standing like gravestones, and the bitter wind howling through the empty streets. She was alive, but she had nothing left. She walked because there was nothing else to do. The city's ruins stretched for miles, jagged silhouettes against a pale gray sky. Ash clung to her skin and hair, settling in the creases of her clothes like snow that never melted. The cold gnawed at her bones, yet she couldn't bring herself to stop moving. Each step was heavy, mechanical, as though her body had separated from her mind and was simply obeying instinct. She didn't look back. There was nothing left in the city to look back to. Beyond the broken outskirts, the ground changed. The concrete gave way to hard-packed earth, cracked and frozen. The remnants of a forest stood ahead, trees stripped bare, their blackened trunks leaning like brittle skeletons. She hesitated at the edge, staring at the shadowed maze before her, before stepping into it. The forest was silent except for the crunch of her boots on the frost-covered ground. Her breath came in short, shallow bursts, visible in the frigid air. Every few steps, she stumbled over a hidden root or a patch of frozen earth. Once she fell hard on her knees, her palms scraping against the sharp stones, and for a moment she didn't rise. She knelt there, trembling, her breath hitching in ragged sobs she hadn't allowed herself before. She pressed her hands to her face, trying to smother the sound, but the sobs came anyway. It wasn't grief alone. It was a kind of hollow ache that felt like her entire body had been carved out from the inside. She thought of her child, their small body warm against her chest, their faint voice murmuring, "Mama." She thought of the way she had promised never to leave them, and how she had failed anyway. The forest didn't care. It stood, indifferent and cold, as she finally pushed herself upright and kept walking. She searched for water, food, anything, but the forest offered nothing. She tried to drink from a shallow stream, but the water was bitter and laced with ash. Her stomach clenched violently, rejecting it. By nightfall, her legs were shaking with exhaustion. She collapsed against the trunk of a fallen tree, pulling her thin coat tighter around herself. The stars were faint, nearly erased by the haze in the sky, but she stared at them anyway. For the first time since the shelter had collapsed, she allowed herself to imagine her child there among the stars, laughing, free of pain, somewhere beyond her reach. The thought brought no comfort. Her mind drifted to the letter she had written, now tucked somewhere deep in the satchel pressed to her chest. She hadn't been able to leave it behind. It was the only piece of herself she could offer, even if no one ever read it. She closed her eyes, whispering the words she had written. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I just want you to live." But she was no longer sure what living meant. The next morning, she forced herself to continue. Her feet were blistered and bleeding by then, but she didn't stop. She wandered deeper into the forest, the trees closing around her like walls. She didn't know where she was going. She only knew she couldn't stay still. If she stopped, she would die. And maybe that would be easier. As she walked, she began to notice remnants of others, an abandoned scarf caught in the branches, a shoe half buried in the frost, the remains of a small fire long since extinguished. She knelt once to touch a set of tiny footprints frozen in the dirt, her fingers tracing the faint outline, a child's. Her breath hitched, and she followed the prints until they vanished among the trees. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat with her back against another dead tree, staring into the darkness, her arms wrapped around her knees. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional groan of wind through the bare branches. She wondered if this was how the rest of her life would feel, wandering, empty, waiting for the cold to finally take her. And then, just before dawn, she heard it, the faintest rustle, like small feet moving through the leaves. She raised her head, her heartbeat quickening. "Hello?" she called softly, her voice hoarse. There was no answer, only the sound of the forest holding its breath. The rustle came again, closer this time, followed by a faint whimper that made her breath catch. She pushed herself up from the frozen ground, every muscle in her body protesting. "Hello?" she called again, her voice softer now, as if afraid to scare away whatever it was. It's okay. I won't hurt you." She took a careful step forward, her boots crunching over brittle leaves and shards of ice. The sound came again, this time to her left, near the hollow trunk of a fallen tree. She crouched low and peered into the shadow. Two eyes stared back at her. A child. They couldn't have been more than 6 or 7. Their face was smudged with dirt, their lips cracked from cold, their thin frame trembling. They were clutching something, a stuffed rabbit missing one ear so tightly that their knuckles had gone white. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The forest seemed to fold in around them, holding its breath. "Hey," she whispered, her voice catching. You're safe now." The child didn't move, only tightened their grip on the rabbit. She saw the fear in their eyes, the same fear she had seen in her own child's eyes so many times before. Her heart twisted painfully. "I don't want anything from you," she said. Reaching slowly into her coat pocket, she pulled out the last scrap of bread from the shelter, now hard as stone, and held it out in her open palm. I just want you to eat this. Please." The child stared at the bread, then at her face. After a long, cautious moment, they stepped forward. Their small hand darted out and snatched the bread before retreating back into the shadow. They nibbled it slowly, their wide eyes never leaving hers. She crouched lower, fighting the ache in her knees. "What's your name?" No answer. "That's okay," she said softly. "You don't have to tell me. You don't have to say anything." She inched closer, moving slowly so as not to frighten them. When she was close enough, she slipped off her coat and held it out. The cold hit her immediately, biting through the thin shirt beneath. But she didn't care. "Here," she murmured. "You're freezing. Put this on." The child hesitated but didn't resist when she gently draped the coat around their shoulders. It swallowed their small body whole, and they clutched it tightly, their trembling slowing just a little. She reached out a hand, uncertain, and brushed a strand of hair from their face. Their skin was ice cold, but they didn't pull away. She swallowed hard. "I'm going to stay with you now," she said. "If that's okay, we'll figure it out together." The child blinked up at her, the faintest glimmer of trust in their eyes. She gathered them into her arms, lifting their feather-light body against her chest. They didn't fight it. They simply pressed their face into her shoulder, clutching the stuffed rabbit between them. The warmth of the small body against hers was almost unbearable. It made her think of the child she had lost, of the fevered breaths and whispered pleas that would never fade from her memory. Tears stung her eyes, but she blinked them back. "I'm not your mother," she whispered, her voice trembling, "but I'll keep you warm. I promise." She didn't ask where the child had come from, or if someone was out there searching for them. Some questions didn't need answers anymore. As she carried the child deeper into the forest, she felt a strange flicker of something she hadn't felt since before the shelter collapsed. It wasn't hope. Exactly. It was something smaller, more fragile, just the faint belief that maybe, for a little while longer, there was a reason to keep walking. The forest was still cold and silent, but it no longer felt entirely empty. She adjusted the coat around the child's shoulders and whispered, "We'll find a place where it's safe. I don't know where yet, but we'll find it." The child nodded faintly, their small fingers curling into her shirt. And for the first time in weeks, she didn't feel completely alone. Snow fell softly outside the small window, muffling the world into silence. The refugee girl, no longer just a girl, but older now, though the shadow of those days never left her face, sat at the rough wooden table, a candle flickering at her elbow. In her hands was the letter. It had arrived the day before, tucked into a worn satchel that had been recovered by someone who recognized her name. She had stared at it for hours before finding the courage to open it. The paper was scorched and frayed at the edges, the handwriting shaky but still legible. She unfolded it slowly, her breath catching as she read the first line. My love. Her brother, now taller and healthier, hovered behind her, peering over her shoulder. He didn't say anything, sensing that this was not a moment for words. The mother's voice filled the room as the girl's eyes moved over the words, a whisper carried by memory. If you're reading this, maybe you're still alive. That's all I ever wanted. Even if I'm not there, I didn't abandon you. I just knew. If you came with me, you would die. But if I left first, maybe you would live. The girl's hands trembled, and a tear slipped down her cheek, staining the fragile paper. I wasn't strong enough to protect you. The letter continued, but I was clear-headed enough not to make another mistake. Perhaps people will never forgive me. Perhaps you won't either. But one day, when you're a parent, you'll understand. Sometimes love means not holding on. Love means turning away, so the other has a chance to live. The girl set the letter down carefully, her throat tight. She remembered the moment the mother had pressed the ticket into her hands, the look in her eyes, the weight of that choice. She remembered stepping onto the convoy, clutching her brother's hand, and glancing back one last time to see the mother standing in the shadows of the tunnel. She picked up a pencil and began to sketch, the movements familiar from the notebook she had carried as a child. The first lines were hesitant, but soon the mother's face began to emerge on the page, hollow-eyed yet strong, framed by strands of dark hair. She drew the bunker door behind her, the faint outline of a hand pressed against the glass. When she was finished, she placed the drawing and the letter into a journal filled with other sketches. Faces she remembered from the shelter, hands giving bread, quiet moments of kindness in a world that had forgotten how to be kind. She closed the journal and pressed it to her chest, the tears falling freely now. The mother's voice lingered, softer now, like a fading echo. No one knew my name. No one knew where I was buried. But if you're alive, that is enough for me. I don't need forgiveness. I just hope, in some dream, you'll run to me and tell me I did the right thing. Outside, the snow fell heavier, blanketing the world in white. The girl stepped out into the cold with her brother, the journal tucked under her arm. The forest stretched before them, silent and endless. But she felt less afraid now. She glanced up at the trees and thought of the mother somewhere out there, gone, but not forgotten. She tied a scrap of cloth to a low branch as they walked, a small piece of fabric worn thin by time. It fluttered gently in the wind, a marker not of death, but of love that had survived in its own quiet way. For a long moment, she stood and watched it dance against the pale sky. Then she turned to her brother and said softly, "Come on, we have to keep going." The sound of their footsteps faded into the snow-covered forest, but in the distance, just for a heartbeat, the girl thought she heard laughter, light and fleeting, like the ghost of a child's joy. She smiled through her tears, clutching the journal closer to her heart. One look like that, she thought, is enough to make the world start healing again. If this story moved you, take a moment to share your thoughts in the comments. What would you have done in her place? Would you have stayed behind or taken your child and run? Each week, we tell stories about the thin line between survival and humanity, about the impossible choices people must make when the world is falling apart. If you want to hear more, consider subscribing and turning on notifications so you don't miss the next one. And if you know someone who needs to feel seen, someone carrying a quiet pain of their own, send them this story. Sometimes, sharing a moment of empathy can change everything. Thank you for being here, for listening, and for keeping these stories alive.